the pH to an exact value such as 7.4. Either way, the pH needs adjustment downward for mashing. Most municipal water treatment plants will happily send you a copy of their current water analysis. All you really need to look at is the overall hardness level, iron content, calcium content, and pH. Although hardness, in of itself, is not bad for mashing, it's generally preferable to have fairly soft water, i.e. overall hardness level of 8 or less. Iron content should be very low, if not zero, i.e. less than 25 ppm. A preferred calcium content is between 50 and 250 ppm, but if it's higher this is not a significant concern, and if it's lower, gypsum can be added. The pH will invariably be too high, but this can be adjusted as discussed in the chapter on mashing. If suitable source water is not available, you can use deionized or distilled water as sold in pharmacies and supermarkets. It's advisable to add 10 milliliters 2 teaspoons of gypsum calcium sulfate, CaSO4, per 20 L of pure water. This will establish a calcium content of about 150 ppm. In the end, what we are doing here is emulating some variation of the mountain spring waters used to make the world's finest whiskies. Some of the more well-known regions are the Scottish Highlands, Ireland, Kentucky, Tennessee, and many other areas in the Appalachian Mountains. Yeast. Yeast is a living organism and is in the mold family of plant cells. The yeast used for fermenting grain mash can be any brewer's yeast. Baker's yeast is simply a form of brewer's yeast, and works just as well. However, commercial whiskey distilleries use specific strains of brewer's yeast, and these strains are closely guarded proprietary secrets. And each whiskey distillery seems to have its own strain. A home brewer can go to a commercial brewery and most breweries will gladly give them a sample of their particular strain of brewer's yeast. But a home distiller cannot seem to get a commercial whiskey distillery to share their proprietary yeast strain. Anyway, Baker's yeast works excellently, and each different strain of pure brewer's yeast, e.g. is produced by Yeast, Brewer's Choice, or yeast labs available at home. Brewers' supply shops gives a slightly different nuance or character to the finished whiskey. With one strain of pure yeast the whiskey will have a distinct nutty character, with another the whiskey will have a creamy flavor, and so on. It's certainly worthwhile experimenting with different strains of brewer's yeast, but until you are thoroughly comfortable with the process, it's highly recommended that you stay with Baker's yeast. Turbo yeasts. Over the past 10 years, a series of yeast preparations for home distillers has been introduced called turbo yeasts. Most of these turbo yeasts are produced in Sweden, and they are absolutely excellent for producing pure alcohol for vodka, gin, and essence-based spirits. Turbo yeasts come in packages of 90 to 200 grams and are typically formulated to ferment a 25 L batch of straight sugar and water. They usually ferment 5 to 8 K of sugar per batch and they produce from 13 to 20% alcohol depending on how much sugar they are designed to ferment. For the 13 to 14% formulations, they ferment in 2 to 4 days. 4. The higher alcohol contents like 17, 18, and 20%, they take up to 2 weeks. Turbo yeasts are comprised of a high alcohol-tolerant yeast strain mixed with yeast nutrients. To supplement the nutrient-lacking sugar and water substrate they are designed to ferment. These turbo yeasts have improved significantly every year since they were introduced about 10 years ago, and it is anticipated that the advancements in genetically engineered yeast strains will open the door to other dimensions of improvements. However, grain mash fermentation has little to gain from turbo yeasts. As mentioned above, turbo yeasts are formulated to ferment very high percentages of alcohol in very nutrient-deficient substrates. Grain mash fermentations are neither high alcohol nor nutrient deficient, and therefore do not need a turbo yeast. It's much like adding chemical fertilizer to watermelons growing in a manure heap. It's great stuff, but they just don't need it. Where to buy yeast? Most people are familiar with buying baker's yeast in supermarkets in small envelopes or jars intended for home baking. But, for the quantities required for making whiskey, this would be a prohibitively expensive way to buy baker's yeast. Baker's yeast can be purchased very cheaply in bulk from a supermarket baking section, delicatessen, health food store, or bulk food store. Most baker's yeast nowadays comes in dried granules called active dried yeast. However, some bakeries still sell it in yeast cakes, which is a wet, creamy form that resembles a pound of butter in its packaging. This form doesn't keep nearly as long as active dried yeast, and you have to use 2.5 times as much to get the same number of yeast cells. For example, if a recipe called for 60 grams of active dried baker's yeast, you would have to use 150 grams of baker's yeast cake. For pure brewer's yeasts, you can buy them at home brewers' supply shops. These yeasts usually come in liquid form in vials or foil envelopes. They are quite expensive and the quantity is usually quite low. In order to use these yeasts, you will have to make a yeast starter to build up the yeast population, as is done for home brewing. This is usually explained on the yeast packaging. For any yeast you are buying, you should always check the use-by date. Expired yeast will not work for fermentation. Calcium sulfate (CaSO4). Calcium sulfate, aka gypsum, is used to increase the calcium content of the mash water. This helps to prepare a mash water that emulates the properties of the mountain spring waters used to make the finest whiskies in the world. Calcium sulfate can be purchased at home winemaking and brewers' supply shops or at chemical suppliers. Glucoamylase. Glucoamylase is a laboratory-prepared enzyme that is used in mashing to reduce, if not eliminate, the proportion of unfermentable sugars in the mash. Mashing using malt enzymes produces a small proportion of unfermentable sugars, dextrins, and polysaccharides. In brewing, these unfermentable sugars are essential to the body and malt character of the beer. But in distilling, they only represent lost alcohol yield. By employing glucoamylase, these unfermentable sugars are converted to fermentable sugars and thereby increase the overall yield. Glucoamylase is used in the distilling industry as produced by pharmaceutical companies, and is not easily accessible in small quantities by the home distiller. Another form of it is packaged for homebrewers to be used in making dry beer, and can be purchased at home brewers' supply shops. It's often just called amylase in these shops. Some home distillers have observed that the use of homebrewers' glucoamylase has very little effect on the reduction of unfermentable sugars, and have decided to stop using it altogether. It's suggested that you prepare a batch or two without using glucoamylase and compare the terminating gravity (TG) explained in the chapter on fermentation to the TG of batches prepared with glucoamylase. If the glucoamylase is working well, you will observe a noticeably lower TG when it is used. 95% sulfuric acid H2SO4. 95% sulfuric acid is used to adjust the pH of the mash water downward. This is covered in the chapter on mashing. Very small amounts, in the order of 10 to 15 drops per 20 L, are ever used. Sulfuric acid is an extremely dangerous and corrosive strong acid and should not, under any circumstances, come into contact with any part of the body or clothing. It should always be stored in a tightly closed container, out of the reach of children. Furthermore, it should only be handled by persons suitably schooled in laboratory procedures for handling strong acids. If you are not comfortable with the idea of handling strong acids, citric or tartaric acid, available at home winemaking supply shops, is perfectly harmless and not poisonous, and can be used with acceptable results. However, since they are weak acids, more will be required to achieve the same pH-lowering results. If using sulfuric acid, it should be the common commercial grade available from chemical suppliers as 95% H2SO4, not battery acid used in the automotive industry. Automotive battery acid contains depolarizing agents and other toxic compounds. Also, it's typically only about 5% H2SO4. Calcium carbonate (CaCO3). Calcium carbonate, aka precipitated chalk, is used to adjust the pH of the mash water upward. This is covered in the chapter on mashing. Calcium carbonate can be purchased at home brewers' supply shops or at chemical suppliers. Thanks for watching. Moonshine Life Recipes Group.